Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well and can hear me okay. My name's Henry and I am a Business Development Manager here at NQA. We're here this afternoon for a 40 to 45 minute webinar on carbon neutrality. I'm going to start off today with a very quick overview of NQA, who we are and what we do, and then I will be passing you over to Jim Smith, who you can hopefully see on your screen, and he will be hosting the main part of the webinar. Next slide, please, Jim. Right, so who are NQA? As you can see, we're a global certification body. We are owned by a large American company called NTS, who are leaders in the testing and inspection industry. We have a large number of standards that we certify to, covering a range of management systems. We've been around for well over 30 years now. We have over 1,000 employees globally with over 50,000 active certificates. This breaks down to just over 100 employees in the UK with 12,000 active certificates. We have an average partnership of over 10 years, which when you consider the certification cycle is 3 years, you can see that there is a high retention of clients there. This is also backed up by our Net Promoter Score, which is a metric calculating the likelihood that a customer would recommend the company product to a colleague or a friend. So the range is between -100 to +100, and NQA is currently at 72, which is the highest within our industry. Our core standards in the UK are the 9001, which is quality management, 14001, which is environmental, and 45001, which is health and safety. However, given the recent pandemic that we've all been through, we've seen a large increase in information security, which is 27001. Obviously, more and more people working from home, so information security has naturally become high in importance and front of mind. Also, 22301, which is business continuity management, follows on nicely from the information security and obviously reflective of the pandemic over the past few years. So if looking at the infographic, as you can see in the US, we are the #1 certification body in the aerospace sector with some extremely high level clients there. We're also #1 in China in the automotive sector by a long stretch, and we are the global #1 certification body in the telecoms and automotive sector. Next slide, please, Jim. So yeah, the certification services and training that we offer, again, are on the basic standards mentioned earlier, the 9, 14, 45. As well as that, we certify and offer training to 50,001, 27,001, 22,301, 13485, which is medical devices, and IATF for automotive and aerospace standards. All of our training services are available both face-to-face and online. Obviously, we've had to make all of our training online recently due to the pandemic, and we've seen a high number of successful remote training for our clients. Next slide, please, Jim. So nationwide training services for all our existing clients. We also offer completely free e-learning services. So however many employees you have in your organisation who you wish to upskill, we can offer that for free. Even if you're not an existing client, it is a really cost-effective way of upskilling your team. And they are good courses. Most of the NQA team have taken the courses as part of their induction. We offer in-house training as well. So let's say you have 5 to 6 employees in your organisation you feel would benefit from a training course, whether it be implementation of a particular standard, internal auditor, or even to a lead auditor level, we'd arrange that. One of our trainers would visit you on site to deliver the requested training. Again, this has been something that's been conducted remotely recently. However, we are getting back to being on site. Then we also have public training courses. So we run these courses in hotels across the UK. And if you were interested, any further information on the training courses are available on our website. Next slide, please, Jim. So that's it from me, short and sweet. Thank you for listening to me. As promised, I am now going to hand you over to Jim Smith from ACJ Risk Solutions to discuss how to get started with becoming carbon neutral and achieving net zero. So Jim, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Henry. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining this webinar. My name, as you can see, is Jim Smith. Delighted to be working with NQA and sharing some information around carbon neutral and net zero. There's a mountain of information available around global warming, greenhouse gases, carbon neutral and net zero, and that's part of the problem. There's just a mountain of it. So this afternoon really is pitched at the level of getting started. I hope you find it useful and helpful. We're going to run for around about 45 minutes. Please pop your questions in the chat box. We'll have some time at the end of the webinar, and I'll answer as many of the questions as I can, and those that I can't answer today, we'll get back to you on. And we are recording the webinar, just so that you know that. So you probably read my brief bio now, and you can tell I'm quite old. My working career started in the 80s and 90s, dealing with regulation around health and safety. A large amount of regulation came into the workplace in the 80s and 90s on health and safety. In the 90s and the noughties, that was followed by Environmental Protection Act. And what I learned from those times was that the key to really making good decisions is around having lots of useful information and the time to make choices about the path forward. So early knowledge here is the key, and that's a theme that we're going to sort of walk back to through the next 40 minutes or so. Really want to try and share with you useful and helpful information, and then let you find the stuff that will help you make decisions for your organizations on the internet. Time is helpful. Regulation is often seen as a burden, but increasingly dealing with regulation successfully can be a competitive advantage. So we're going to also look at some of the opportunities that considering the path forward on carbon neutral and net zero actually bring to organizations. So this won't be a doom and gloom and we're all done for presentation on carbon neutral and net zero, more of a how to get started. So these are the three main learning points I'm hoping to move through. What do the terms mean? What do they really mean? What is the UK government expecting businesses to do? And how do we know? And then how to get started. The things that we can do if we choose to move forward on the path of becoming carbon neutral. And as we move through the path to net zero with governments asking organisations to support the drive towards the milestone of 2050. There are quite a few acronyms, as you can imagine, in this this environment, and I'll do my very best to explain those as we go through. But if there's any that I use or any that you see on the slides, please just pop a question into the question box and I'll cover them at the end. So firstly, some good news. This is the most detailed slide that we've got. So let's dive straight into the terminology, carbon neutral and net zero. And they are actually quite different. In conversation, in the media and through politicians and organizations, these terms are often used interchangeably, but they mean very different things. So carbon neutral is defined as meaning purchasing carbon reduction credits equivalent to emissions release without the need for emissions reductions to have taken place. So it's very specific what it means. Net zero means something very, very different. So net zero means reducing emissions in line with the latest climate science and balancing those remaining residual emissions through carbon removal credits. The boundary for carbon neutral is very different to the boundary for net zero. So carbon neutral, as you can see on the slide, can refer to specific product services of the whole organization. So a thing, a box of cornflakes, could be defined or referred to as carbon neutral, but not net zero. So net zero is around the organization. The organization can be defined in three different ways. It can be defined in terms of financial control, or operational control, or equity participation. So the amount of a business that an organization actually owns. This is relevant for complex organizations where there may be a number of joint ventures within the whole organization. So if you ever hear somebody say, my product is net zero, that's unlikely to be correct. It may be what they believe, but it's unlikely to be correct. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a mountain of information and discussion around this whole topic. It can be confusing, but carbon neutral and net zero are very different at the front end, what they mean, and at the back end, what we can do about them. So the level of ambition is different. You can see that. I don't intend to read all the words on the slide. You've no doubt read that already. And existing standard and certification is quite an important point here. Carbon neutral does have an existing standard, PAS 2060. So PAS, PAS, means publicly available specification. Not quite the same as an ISO management standard, but nevertheless, it's a recognized standard, and PAS 2060 is recognized for carbon neutrality, and that can be certified. So bodies such as you can see there, the Carbon Trust, NQA, are able to certify products, services, or organizations against the requirements of PAS 2060. There are no existing standards and certification for net zero. Net zero is more of a goal, which involves the setting of targets to work towards. So again, please be wary. If you hear somebody say, a supplier come to you or a customer talk to you about the standard of net zero, there is no current certification for meeting the requirements of net zero. Timeframes are different as well. Time frame for carbon neutral is quite short term. It's stuff that we can be getting on with and doing now and certifying against now, whereas net zero is much more of a long-term goal. As we move through the slides, you'll see it's quite a complex process to move towards net zero. So it's not something that's going to be achieved quickly. And then briefly, a point about offsetting. And again, offsetting can be a bit of a minefield, so please be careful if you're getting involved in using carbon offsets, because they're not all the same. They're provided by different people for different reasons, and they have different levels of credibility. And in terms of carbon neutral and net zero, then again, the use of offsets is for different things. For carbon neutral, it's for reduction, and for net zero, it's for removal. And scopes, we'll touch on the importance of understanding emission scopes through the presentation. So scopes 1, 2, and 3 are relevant. 1 and 2 are very relevant for carbon neutral. 1, 2, and 3 are relevant for net zero. So the second point guiding us through this presentation is around what the UK government is expecting business to do. So the government issued a strategy in October. It's available off the internet. Quite a nice publication. Really splits into those 10 points that you can see there. And when I read that, I thought, that's great. I don't have to do anything. The government's going to cover all these 10 points, and that's going to be all that the UK needs to do. That great long list of things, someone else will do it, and there's nothing I need to do. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the reality is a little bit different. The UK government last year also issued a document called PPN 0621, so Procurement Policy Note 0621, June 21, which described for organisations that wish to have business of over £5 million with the government, the requirements of becoming net zero and documenting a formalised carbon reduction plan. So this 10-point plan that we see here, the Build Back Greener strategy, is something that government will be sponsoring. The practical stuff that the government is doing is really came alive in September of 2021 with Policy Procurement Note 0621. So if you have time, it's not a great big document, and you're involved in providing services or products to the government, and you have an annual value of around £5 million or more, then this is something that will be relevant to you and your organisation, and it's worth taking a look at the detail. but essentially it brings to life the requirements for organisations that do business with the government to do more than just consider, but actually to develop and deliver on the requirements of net zero, scopes 1, 2, scopes 3 as well, and a carbon reduction plan. So that's the practical reality of some of the documentation moving from being discussion points into policies and having an operational and commercial reality. So large organisations already are familiar with an acronym called SECR, SECR, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. And 3 groups of businesses are affected by SECR that came into force in April 2019. And you can see that those 3 types of businesses there. They're very large businesses generally. They're quoted on stock markets, or they meet the definition of large, which you can see at the bottom of this screen, or they're large limited liability partnerships, LLPs. So if your business, you operate or are employed in a business that meets these criteria, then your organisation will be preparing SECR reporting and will be familiar with the requirements of SECR around carbon reporting and around developing formal structures and reduction plans. Now, SMEs are the next level down from large organisations. So SMEs really encompass businesses with a turnover of less than 36 million and less than 250 people, but they're very significant to the economy. They operate widely in all sectors. They account for a large number of employees, around half, and there are a massive number of businesses. So SMEs will also be involved in the country's journey sponsored by the government to net zero in 2050. So if you're not familiar with SECR, that's absolutely fine, because it's likely to be that you're not involved in being employed by a large organisation. But you will be seeing those large organisations starting to talk to their supplier bases, because scope 3 emissions require organisations to consider the value chain, and the value chain runs from suppliers through the operation and organisation itself to its customers and to its end use customers. So we know, what do we know? We know that the government has issued a 10-point Build Back Greener plan. We know that the government has issued a policy procurement note requiring large chunks of business to go to suppliers that can demonstrate they take the journey of carbon neutral and net zero seriously, and that they come up with a carbon reduction plan and publish it. What follows from that is large organisations then turning to their supplier base, that tends to be smaller organisations, and wanting the same from them. So it might seem in 2022, January 2022, that this is quite remote, abstract, and perhaps even an academic activity, but that's not the case. 2050 seems a long time off, but the operational and commercial impact of that journey is now coming to bear on both businesses that are large in size and those that are smaller in size. So how do we get started on that journey? Finding out in 2022 what the expectations are and what we're going to be required to do, and how is it that we can take this forward. Let's start with a quick recap. We talked about scopes in the early slide. Scopes 1 is direct emissions, scope 2 indirect, and scope 3 through the value chain. And you may recall that carbon neutral is really focusing on scopes 1 and scope 2 only. And if you are involved in energy management at the moment, or energy efficiency or utilization, you're probably quite familiar with the activities that go on around scopes 1 and scope 2, because it's the obvious stuff. It's the fuel that we burn, the vehicles that we drive. If you're running manufacturing process, then it will be the emissions from those processes. And fugitive emissions really refers to things like air conditioning systems and greenhouse gases. And then scope 2, we're all pretty familiar with, because it's the energy that we buy, whether that's electricity or heat or steam. But that long list of items in scope 3 is very relevant as we consider net zero, because net zero requires us to look at all 3 scopes: the direct emissions, those that are indirect, and the vast number that are through the value chain. The greenhouse gas protocol itself is a fantastically detailed document. It really is the sort of touchstone for much of the practical discussions that are taking place now following the scientific deliberations that have taken place in recent years. But it's rather long. It's around 116 pages. But it gives some very useful examples of organizations that are already on the journey to net zero. So if you're looking for examples of what you should be considering or could be considering, then I would say have a quick look at Greenhouse Gas Protocol document, and there's some excellent information in there. The Carbon Trust in the UK is also a very strong provider of useful information and well worth visiting their website. You also have resources available to you through NQA, who are actively involved in this whole area, along with some other certification bodies. And then there are a large number of organizations that are publishing through their corporate reports, their carbon reduction programs, the benchmarking that they do, and the challenges that they face. So we're starting to see some real examples of organizations getting to grips with their journey through net zero, and also the early stages of carbon neutral. So, quick reminder, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Scope 1 and 2, organizational footprints must include that. There is flexibility amongst those 15 items in Scope 3, which to measure and report, but they must be reflected in the goals that are chosen. And of course, all the documents that are provided that go on the corporate reports, on the investor pages, on company websites, are freely available to suppliers, customers, and everybody else. So large organizations take a lot of time and trouble in putting these reports together. Let's just do a double check that we're all comfortable with what a greenhouse gas is. So most commentators, news reports tend to focus on carbon dioxide, CO2, as being the main one. But there are other gases which have an importance in certain industrial sectors. And you can see there are 5 others categories. Methane, which tends to come from the agricultural sector, as well as nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, so hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorinated chemicals, sulfur hexafluoride. So if you're running air conditioning systems, you may well have leakages. Most systems have leakages, and those emissions need to be quantified. And nitrogen trifluoride, not commonly used, but used in some manufacturing processes. So a greenhouse gas is not just CO2, that's the point of this slide. While we will talk a little bit about how reporting is mainly converted back to tons of CO2 equivalent, then capturing any emissions caused by these 5 primary greenhouse gases also becomes important. This slide just talks about getting going and calculating the carbon footprint as being a first step. So it's very difficult to make a plan for progress unless we know what the baseline start point is. Most commentators would recommend that you look at a 1 year period of time as being a baseline. A month is definitely too short in terms of calculating emissions. A quarter and even 6 monthly doesn't really take into account seasonality. And so I would recommend to you, if you're considering capturing and calculating your carbon footprint by understanding your emissions in scopes 1 and 2 for net zero purposes, then choose a baseline year. Doesn't really matter whether it's a calendar year or a financial year. It's a year that makes sense to you and your organization. But don't pick anything shorter than a year as being representative of your operation, because it will mislead you, and it will make setting targets and monitoring progress against those targets very difficult. You could report your footprint accurately to a third party if you want. So we've already talked about the SECR reporting, the streamlined environmental and carbon reporting for large organizations. They're already doing this. If you're just getting started or thinking about getting started, you may not want to share that information initially. You may want to wait until you believe it's stable and that your operations are, in a particular year, are representative of what you do and will be doing going forward. So you have a choice, really. But getting started is about measuring, converting to tons of CO2 equivalents. That's the standard measure. There are government conversion factors used to convert energy usage and emissions to those. If you don't know how to find those, just stick a question in the chat box and we can get that information out to you. So it's just to summarize the first few slides on the journey before we get into the detail, and just share a few ideas about practical things that we all could be thinking about doing and getting on with. For SMEs, the journey is really about making a commitment. That's not necessarily, doesn't mean necessarily putting it on your website or sharing it with all your customers and suppliers. It's about the leadership team deciding that the journey through net to zero via carbon neutral is something that the organization chooses to do in advance of being mandated to do by the government. So the commitment is more of a spiritual or an emotional commitment to providing the resources to kickstart the journey, probably initially through net zero and scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but almost inevitably capturing scope 3 emissions as the whole economy moves towards being net zero in a time frame that will span sort of the next generation of working, really. Calculate baseline emissions, so we've talked about those. Pick a year. I wouldn't pick a shorter period. But it can be a calendar year or it can be a financial year. Something that we haven't mentioned so far this afternoon is the green tariff. So most energy suppliers now share the source of their energy. So you have a choice as an energy purchaser whether to purchase from those that supply only renewables or those that supply a hybrid. And then importantly, obviously, make a plan to reduce. Using the acronym SMART, many of you I'm sure are aware of SMART, so make them specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time bound. And that's why really the commitment is important, because making the plan to reduce is going to require resources. And so organizations and the leadership of those organizations need to be comfortable once the commitment is made that what follows from the commitment is the support for the resources to make the carbon reduction plan a living thing that sits within and alongside the business plan, financial plan, commercial plans, all the other plans that exist within many businesses. So SMEs face challenges normally around resources and expertise, because by their nature they're smaller. They may not always have the expertise that sits in-house or the time to tackle the things they want to tackle. Well, I would say, if you're not sure how to get started, then talk to people that have done it. NQA have a massive customer base, so they have a lot of experience and expertise sitting within the organisation. So I would say talk to them about their expertise in-house and about the learning journeys that they've been on in the last few years. So SMEs really ought to start thinking about understanding emissions. What's currently going on in the organisation? What are we doing right now? And what can we change? The drivers for action on carbon reduction will almost, as night follows day, managing emissions is linked to reducing energy and reducing costs and increasing profits. Working with suppliers effectively is always a good thing to do, but utilising the expertise of your suppliers to help reduce or minimise your carbon emissions and energy usage in-house. The customers expect increasingly organisations to take the environment seriously. There's a new generation of buyers. They have an enhanced view or an extended view beyond the sort of historical ones of price, value, service delivery, and so on. They're now interested, buyers are interested in their suppliers' attitudes to the environment, specifically carbon reduction. So their expectations have changed. New markets are opening up. So a few minutes ago, we talked about, or we showed the Build Back Greener 10-point plan. Well, some of that technology is new. So there will be new industries, and what commentators call the green economy will grow, probably quite quickly, in fact, probably also quite quickly in the UK compared to other areas. So there are new markets and opportunities opening up in new sectors. So this isn't a regulation that's just designed to be a burden. It's regulation that's designed really to take the economy into a new direction. And that provides opportunities. And reputation. Consumers, so not just buyers, but consumers are making choices around what products and services to buy based on the green reputation of the choices placed in front of them. And that's also a reality of this century, maybe not so relevant last century, but certainly is this century. So commitments, as we said, can be done internally and externally. Internally, I think it's a very important one. That I would always recommend that you make sure that the organisation is aligned around the journey to either or both of carbon neutral and net zero. Otherwise, the initiative's likely to stall because there isn't the will to move forward. But there is also the opportunity to make external commitments. So a couple of organisations I mentioned, their Science-Based Targets Initiative, which you'll see a lot of information on the internet about, or the Climate Hub. And there are a few others, more and more actually each month, offering themselves as being a place where commitments can be made. So back to the basics. Calculating baseline emissions. Let's start with scopes 1 and 2, and then we can look at the wider value chain. Mentioned tariffs earlier on this afternoon. One of the things to look for is another acronym, REGO, Renewable Energy Guarantee of Origin. That kind of will help you differentiate from your suppliers, those that are truly green electricity suppliers and those that maybe are not quite so green. So that's another acronym perhaps to look for if you're searching for suppliers that can provide you with green electricity suppliers. So let's talk a little about energy efficiency. So it's something that tends to, energy efficiency is something that tends to move in and out of the vision of leadership teams, depending largely on the pricing of the utility that's being bought, whether that's natural gas or electricity or something else. But in the world of carbon neutral and net zero, and looking at the scope 3 emissions of the value chain, then energy efficiency does have a role to play, because obviously the less energy that the economy uses, then the less energy that has to be supplied by the country, because certainly in the UK, we all buy our electricity from the grid, which is a national utility, albeit privatised through its steps. So energy efficiency now has moved beyond just local cost savings, but also has an impact on the infrastructure, which itself has an impact on the UK's journey towards carbon neutral, or through carbon neutral to net zero. So, same thing again, understand your baseline emissions. Reduction plans should be built around a robust business case. Robust business cases will typically cover some very hard and tangible benefits like cost, but increasingly they're also covering some emotional aspects around customer perception, so individual customer perception, reputation, and acceptability in terms of the way that organisations do business in a green and what seem to be an ethical and a positive way. So the business case will cover those points we raised a few slides ago, not just cost, but reputation and acceptance to buyers from other organisations wanting to place their business with those organisations that have credible credentials around carbon neutrality and the journey to net zero. Let's look at some practical stuff. So I would guess that we've got folks on the call, yourselves on the call, from a wide range of sectors. Hopefully I've covered some of them here. So here's some typical both energy efficiency measures and carbon reduction opportunities for SMEs, which can be taken now because they have a benefit now. Lighting pops up a lot. It's very common now to go into premises where the lighting is through the use of LED fittings rather than the old fluorescent fittings or even halogen fittings, and that the lighting controls are activated by motion detectors. So some of you may have been in relatively new builds where this is quite common, where the lights come on as you walk through because there's a motion detector. This is very common in large warehouses now as well. Heating systems, where the control of the heating is not left to the owners or occupiers of the building, but is run off a thermostat, centralized thermostat. So lighting and heating are two big areas where organizations can make fast savings and reduce their carbon reduction, reduce their carbon usage. Transportation is another important one. So many organizations run either truck fleets or car fleets. Use of telematics and investing in driver training and so on can reduce fuel usage quite significantly. So in my experience, when we installed telematics, we saw a 15% saving in fuel usage from the it was a Salesforce fleet that we were working with, just by giving the drivers feedback on their driver behavior and helping them to make to change their driving behaviors to use less fuel. The 15% of our fuel bill was a big number, and telematic technology has moved on, and I would say that's something that many organizations who are running their own fleet should look at. And you can also look at electrification. That's another thing that we're starting to see in the economy, larger organizations moving their van fleets from diesel or petrol to being powered by electricity. So this list here is not exclusive, but hopefully it gives you some ideas of, okay, well, we've heard all this stuff, what can we actually start doing? Well, here's some of the stuff you can do. Look at the lighting, look at heating systems, look at wherever energy is used, how that energy is controlled, whether it's controlled by process or whether it's left to individuals to turn things on and off. And importantly, in transportation, a couple of things to look at there is electrification and the use of technology to support changes in driver behaviour to reduce fuel usage per mile driven. So again, you'll get copies of all these slides. So hopefully, when you come back and reflect on this, this will give you, if you want to talk to your organisation about moving forward, and someone asks you the question, well, what can we do? This is the sort of thing that you can be looking at. Most of these have very fast paybacks, as do some of these. So again, some more ideas just to share with you to help you think about the journey from this point on. Cycle to work scheme for your employees. So these would typically be in your scope 3 emissions. This is about the carbon emissions from your employees going to their place of work, whether that's spread around the country or whether it's from a central office. Building insulation. So prior to, well, last year, I think we in the news was the sort of special interest group making the point that the building stock in the UK was poorly insulated. So you perhaps look at your buildings and say, what can we do? Insulation is a relatively cost-effective way of reducing heating energy. LED bulbs we've talked about. LED bulbs linked to motion detectors makes a lot of sense because then the lighting really is only used when people are in the area and need to see. It seems very obvious, but is not always done. Heating and cooling thermostats, system timings. Again, it's not uncommon for me to do an energy audit and go to a premises and see it out of hours and the lights are on and the building's quite warm, but there's nobody there. The other part of heating, which is extremely expensive and has lots of emissions, is around space heating. So the traditional way that buildings were heated was to heat the space so that the people working there could be warm wherever they were in the building. The more modern way now is to focus the heat energy on the work areas and not to heat the whole building. Heating the whole building is extremely expensive and inefficient, and there are different technologies that are available, and this can be done differently. And heating and lighting are two of the largest forms of energy use and therefore carbon emissions amongst most of the organisations that I visit and work with. Smart meter, so raising awareness, always a good thing. What gets measured gets done. I would guess most of us have no idea what our energy usage is at home until we see the bills. And I would guess most employees have no idea what the energy usage is in their company ever, because they don't pay the bills. So smart meter and the use of half-hourly data, which is often available for larger organisations to see how their energy is used every half an hour, is a very useful tool for developing smart goals around energy efficiency and carbon reduction, and electrification we've talked about. So finally from me, before we go to try and help answer some of the questions, just to a glossary of terms. We started the presentation really with sort of three goals, which were to explain about carbon neutral zero. So those are the definitions repeated for you. I put the greenhouse gas protocol in there because it is an extremely useful document. It's a lot to read end to end, but it contains lots of useful case studies and provides great information that's non-commercial. It's been produced for all different types of people. PAS 2060 is important because it's the only recognised standard we have for carbon neutrality. We don't have one at all yet for net zero. And it's something that NQA will help you with. If you don't understand what a public available specification is, they'll guide you through that, and they have expertise in-house to help you if that's the journey you wish to go on. And science-based targets, that phrase has been used a little bit. It will become something that's more apparent to us as we move through the next weeks and months, because as companies start to be more open about the progress that they're making on carbon reduction, then they will need to show that they're using science-based targets. So this slide here, the intention of this slide here is just to give you that glossary of terms, some of the key phrases that we've used through the last 40 minutes or so. So if I can work the technology, I'm going to pick up some of these questions. Thank you very much for answering those. And I do apologize if I miss anybody out. As I said, we'll capture all of these and get back to you. So someone's asked, is there a simple tool to calculate net carbon? Yes, there is. I would talk to NQA about the verification process, because you really want to use a tool. So this is, I've been asked by Paul. So Paul, if you're still here, I would say, please get in touch with NQA, because if you're going to use a tool to try and calculate your carbon emissions, then you really want to be able to have that verified. Otherwise, it becomes a number that, when challenged, doesn't have any credibility. Nicola has asked, does PPN 0621 include suppliers of service to local governments or only to central governments? Well, they are. If the key thing here is, if the contract is worth over £5 million a year, then PPN 0621 applies. So hopefully that helps. And it's not a big document to download. PPN 0621, thankfully, is only about 8 pages. It's actually written quite well. It's written to be understood rather than to be overly scientific. So I think it's a good document. What about ISO 14064? Yes. So a lot of the ISO standards take us in that direction. So many of my generation are familiar with 14001 and even 50001. Interestingly, we don't yet have an ISO standard for net zero. That may be something that will take a lot of debate before we get there. But I think they're all taking us in the same direction, about measuring, understanding our baseline emissions, developing credible plans and programs, and providing the resources to make progress. So Robert's also asked about conversion to carbon. Yes, if you get, well, I will email that to you, Robert, if you want. So if we can get your details through NQA, then that's no problem to get that to you. That's available on the website. If you Google government conversion factors, then there's a spreadsheet with about 20 tabs in, which is relatively easy to understand, that helps you convert things from like kilowatt hours or litres of diesel or whatever it is that you've counted, and convert that to tons of CO2 equivalent. So then Rupert has asked about where do we focus? Well, the UK is probably leading the pack, and I recognise that for those that work in organisations that span the world, then there are different priorities in different areas from time to time. But organisations that are quoted in the UK already have to do the SECR reporting, the streamlined environment and carbon reporting, so we'll be familiar with that. What I would say from a UK perspective is there's a benefit sometimes to being an early adopter in a journey that we're all going on. So there's no doubt that the economy is pretty much committed to moving to net zero in 2050. So that's the direction of travel. And there's a benefit in really understanding that this is what's coming, and being ahead of the game can bring some benefits to the organisation. So I would say, while the focus can be on the UK initially, because it's probably possible to define that organisation, then the learnings from that can then be shared to other parts of the global corporation. So there's no reason, I don't think, to stop or not to start just because the organisation has activities around the world. So Martin has asked about the requirement for absolute zero. I think it's a great question about where we're going to end up with this. I think as we learn more about the technology that's available, the alternative technologies that are available. There'll be an appetite to move faster and to move further. I think it's quite an exciting space for those organisations that want to get on the bus early. There's probably the best seats are on the empty bus, and I think standards tend to follow. There becomes a sort of cycle of discovery, and then an appetite for movement, and then a demand for some way of establishing credibility. And that credibility, excuse me, really often is linked to the establishment of standards. So credibility and quality. If an organisation was to say it has great quality systems, a follow-up question would be: do you have ISO 9001 certification, and is it UCAS accredited? And if the answer is yes, then that becomes a credible quality management system. And if the answer to that question around certification is no, then maybe that becomes, maybe, not always, maybe that becomes a less credible quality management system. Just click through these. Okay, so Olivia's asked about heating controls in warehousing. So there are lots of suppliers. Olivia, if you're able to, if we have your details through friends at NQA, then I can point you towards some places to give you some ideas on what you might do there. Okay, great question from Mike. In the government conversion factors, what's the difference between gross and net kilograms of CO2, and gross and net CO2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent? It's a great question, Mike. I don't have the answer now. I have to look it up, but I will do, and we'll give you the response to that one. Then Ray has asked about, I think it's Canada and New Zealand, I think. If it's that, then I think what you're noticing there, Ray, is that this is something that's growing, and because the technology is starting to catch up with the aspiration, then we're starting to see signs of progress on carbon reduction, sustainability, energy efficiency. So things around us now are changing. So we now have electric cars. We see wind turbines in the hills. If you fly out, I live up in the northwest of England, if you fly out over Liverpool Bay, then there's offshore wind farms. We are used to having our houses double glazed. We are used to going into facilities in large department stores where they have motion detectors linked to the lighting. So I think that we've moved, as I said, from a scientific discussion and debate through the legislation and the political processes into what's practical, what can be done. And what we're starting to see is this is what can be done. Rachel has asked, should we start any actions before we gather all the data? I think the data is worth gathering first, because it helps infuse and encourage people when they see the progress. Not an absolute, you must have all the data before you can do any good stuff. But without the data, then it's difficult to interpret and understand the impact of the good stuff, the practical stuff that might be done. So, and if you have a problem with the data and how to get it, again, if your details are with NQA, Rachel, then get back to you and share some thoughts about how that could be done. And that's the same with anybody. So Keris has asked a question about energy audits, and happy to share with folks about steps that can be taken. NQA, I say, are an excellent source of knowledge and expertise, and happy to just bounce ideas around about things that any of you might want to do in the future. And Kevin has asked about training courses on PAS 2060. Yes, Kevin, I'd point you towards NQA directly there. I think they do some very practical and appropriate courses, so not too theoretical, but practical courses around PAS 2060 and auditing. Is a company allowed to claim, so this is Anna, is the company allowed to claim carbon neutral without a net zero plan? So carbon neutral and net zero are a little bit different. So it's back to scopes 1 and 2. So yes, you can make progress on carbon neutral. If you would like it to be verified for your organization or your product, then that you'd need to talk to somebody like NQA. So NQA are approved to provide certification for PAS 2060, which is the standard for carbon neutral. And obviously, working on scopes 1 and 2 for carbon neutrality actually helps sort of springboard you into net zero, because you have to do, or we all have to do, scopes 1 and 2 for net zero anyway. So it probably, to me, would make sense to get the credit for the effort around scopes 1 and 2 and get certified for carbon neutral, and then use that learning to springboard you along the journey of net zero. Hope that makes sense. Government conversion factors, again, if you're stuck with that, please get in touch with NQA and we'll pick that up for you. Scope 3 emissions, we've talked about that. That's complex area, scope 3 emissions. So Jane has asked this, I would point you towards the greenhouse gas protocol. Not all of the 100 odd pages are on scope 3, but a lot of them are. And again, if you get stuck, send me a note, and we'll try and help you with a bit more clarity around that. Some say, and Vidya has asked about energy to turn off and on lights. Is this true? Well, it kind of depends how long you're going to leave them on for or turn them off for. My thoughts would be is they should be on when you need them and off when you don't, because it's a resource that's being used to provide a service of lighting when that's required, but it's not always necessary. As we know, if we go into empty buildings that have the lights on, that's truly a wasted resource. Stephen has asked about, does PPN 0621 cover NHS Trust? I'll have to look, Steve. Stephen, I'm sorry, I hadn't researched that, so we'll have to get back to you on that one. I'm conscious that we're coming up to the last couple of minutes, see if I can cover a few more. Conversion factors we've talked about, Ryan. So if anyone's stuck, Google government conversion factors for energy, and you should get a spreadsheet. And if you can't find it, let us know and we'll send it to you. Scope 3 emissions is a very blunt instrument, Jane. I think the intention there is to avoid organisations outsourcing their energy usage by outsourcing activities that they truly control. So I think that's the intention behind scope 3 emissions. And I think that there'll be a lot of learning around how to correctly and accurately calculate and estimate scope 3 emissions as time progresses, which is why I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think the first step would be think about scope 1 emissions and scope 2 emissions, and maybe prepare for carbon neutral verification through PAS 2060. Use that learning on scope 1 and 2 emissions to develop a carbon reduction plan. And then what will happen is the world will have moved on and there'll be a much clearer understanding around how to demonstrate net zero. I'm awfully sorry I'm not going to be able to get to answer all the questions. Thanks ever so much for dropping them in the box. I do hope that this presentation has been useful and help you. And thank you so much for sharing your time this Friday. And I wish you all the best for the weekend. Thank you very much.